Hi, it's Niko here. So this is my continuation of my biography, my story of my life, really. And I want to focus on this chapter on giving and receiving care, because I think that's a really important aspect to focus on. I know it's taken up a lot of my time and, well, a lot of my memories are about both receiving and also trying to give care to others. And I guess that's such an important thing in our life, really, in everyone's life, really. I know there's an old African saying, a proverb that I remember well, that says it takes a whole village to bring up a child, as it takes a child to burn down a village. That each one of us, I believe, is so important that our support comes from a whole variety, just different friends, family, social group, from all different places. My own personal story, I've got a lot to be grateful and thankful for. My foster parents, Rich and Christy, and a lot of friends of the family also that were very supportive, very nourishing, counselling, providing material but also emotional support as well. Especially important when you have when you're in a foster child background, there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know about your own parenting. And also, I had a mental condition as well. So I suppose that made it extra hard. But I received a lot of support and care from it. And I'm very thankful to the foster parents, especially for that in my formative years. Whatever mistakes were made, I know they worked hard and gave a lot of love and care and attention and their time. And I'm thankful for friends that I had at that time. I had a few close friends as well. I'm thankful to too many, actually. The scout leaders that made it a really great, enjoyable, productive couple of years with them. I learned life skills that set me up for my lifetime, really. And also learned as well about how to get on with people in different circumstances. A few teachers at school, especially, that really encouraged me, that worked hard with me, took the time to sort of speak to me when they were concerned. And, you know, those things that I learned, again, have set me up for my lifetime of learning, of skills that I've used throughout my life that have benefited myself and others. It's just almost like there's too many people to thank, and a lot of the time it's people that care for you in small amounts, and a lot of different people. So it's not just scout leaders, friends of the family, but also a few teachers at school, people that cared in a whole variety of ways. I had a lovely social worker back then as well, and we got on very well. He had very kind, caring talks with me. He was very patient. And so, whatever hardships I went through in that age, there was a lot of misunderstanding about my condition. There was some bullying at school. It wasn't too bad for a couple of years. It was a little homophobic. And I think a lot of people just didn't understand me sometimes. And I felt an inability at an early age to express myself that well. So perhaps I wasn't always able to get all the support I needed, but I'm thankful for the great support that I had in my early formative years that really has set me up in my life. It gave me a good academic grounding as well, good grammatic skills where I was able to read and write fairly well, and to be IT literate and those sort of things. That's been really useful. To be honest, if I look back at a broader perspective, moving on from the childhood, support continued throughout my life, really. I was very fortunate. I had a lot of very deep, meaningful personal relationships that were mutually supportive. I think when I left the foster family, I was about 16, 17. I moved out home at that age. It's quite an early age to be independent. Well, I was flat sharing the bills and the room with a friend. And then I had a couple of older kind of big brother figures. They were like almost father figures, really. And I suppose not having my own foster family, the foster family then had moved on. We were in some contact, but not as regular as before. And I think really a few friends took on a role of being like a father figure or like an older brother sometimes as well. They would be more emotionally counselling and supportive of me, encouraging, making sure I did pay the bills and went to work okay, found jobs, went to college classes, went back to study my A levels. Um, and in a way, they were partly friends as well as also fatherly figures, and encouraging me to be productive and to manage my finances well, to be sustainable, to look after myself, and I think it's that kind of encouragement, not just practical things, someone to cook with, to eat with, to clean up for, and with, having conscientious friends that were caring and considerate. Now, I was a young gay man with an unknown autism, without any parents around, I did have mum that I was getting to know, but we didn't know each other that well in those teenage years. So I really lacked any kind of reliable long-term family support. I kept in contact with Richard over many years and visited him, and we remained close in that over years. But I know the foster family as a whole had to move on as well. And I know the legal responsibility of the foster parents had ended, obviously, when I was 18. I'm glad that we did keep in contact. I kind of had a lot of friends that really became like family members, really, as close as family members, really. And there was almost, I wouldn't say a conveyor belt, but I would say that there was a continuity of a few different father figures, aunt figures in particular. Love all my aunt figures, especially, and the father figures, despite all the arguments. And sometimes I suppose there were arguments, even with fatherly type friends. Sometimes, I would get too drunk often. I know that doesn't sound like me, does it? So there would be arguments at home sometimes. No, it wasn't a perfect relationship, but there was a lot of care on both sides. And I also tried to please them, to work hard and be responsible. And I think it works well when you have others that are responsible and older and able to care for you. And I think it worked as well that some of the friends were older gay men, actually, because they could relate to me well. We used to go out, we had mutual friends on the gay scene, friends of different ages. I had a large group of friends about my own age, and a couple of partners I had were about my age too. But it was also nice to have older gay men as well that could look out for you, that were sort of streetwise and also wise on giving you advice on going out and how to be wary, how to be cautious, how to have fun when you're out, but how to be safer around others, and just to be sensible and giving out advice in that. And I think it worked having a balance of people around about my own age. But, yes, at that age, you're highly strung, you're emotional. I had a lot of wild things that I did then, things that I do regret, actually. And I was hugely neurotic at the time. I didn't do anything that awful, but it was regular that I would get quite drunk. And we had lots of house parties, some wonderful times then. We had a great circle of friends, lots of mutual friends. Everyone knew each other. It was quite villagey, really. I think maybe on a small gay scene, as Bristol was back then, it perhaps gets like that as well, really. We all gossiped, we all kind of talked about each other. A few of us got on well. There were all the politics and different groups and people of different temperaments who struggled to get on with, So it wasn't ideal and always easy, but it was nice meeting people of different genders and sexualities as well. People that were more effeminate and some people that were more androgynous, and also guys that were just really kind of down to earth, straight acting guys, actually. So to meet people that were different temperaments as well, it was good. We all supported each other through that, and I think in Freedom Youth, that's where we began having that mutual support. And we actually remained as close friends outside of that for several years. Where we met up, we were able to get on and talk to each other. Relationship counselling. We took a great interest in what partners each other were seeing, where we were living, the jobs we had, the student classes we had, all those kind of things, really. The different trials that you go through in adolescence, really, as well as just having a laugh, people to go out with, dance partners. I was lucky that I had a few close romantic relationships, and I think that they were mutually beneficial up to a point. I think that there's a point they didn't go beyond, and I couldn't perhaps go beyond that, really. I think that I was emotionally kind of over the top sometimes, too much that I wasn't able to sustain a deeply intimate personal relationship in those earlier years. I did have a few, but they all became argumentative. There were 3 or 4. I'm not saying there wasn't a lot of good and love and funny things and hilarity and a lot of interesting, fun talk as well. And of course, there were so many more good things in it, enough to sustain it. And I look back on all of those relationships. I think there were 3 or 4 very close personal relationships that I had, and a large number of good, close friendships as well. And I really look back and I thank God, and I'm really grateful for all of those relationships. And I know that there were bad things in them, and I don't want to nostalgize and romanticize the past. For my own part, I didn't drink heavily in those early years, but I was neurotic, and I did sometimes do crazy things. Sometimes, if I went too far and too crazy, I think that was exceptional in that. But I hurt other people in it sometimes, especially in those early years when I was 16, 17. I could be very cold in my feelings. I look back at that now and think like how I hurt others sometimes. People that I loved with, people that I shared love with, and I was in love with. And I did love, and there were many great things about it. But how I had an ability to just cut off my emotions and be cold sometimes, and to do something so irrational and hurtful without any consideration of the person. Um, I'm deeply ashamed of doing some of those things, really. Where I would, for example, I would just argue unrelentingly with someone, even when they've told me something and I know how they feel, but I would persist and go on and grind them down to get my feelings, because I'm obsessed and I feel so strongly about something, but I didn't take the time to consider how the other person felt and how it reacted on them. Um, and I think there were a few times with that, that I think also, it's not just being argumentative sometimes and not knowing when to stop and when to sort of listen and care about other people's feelings more, and not just pursue the truth, but also to try and be considerate and caring in that, and not be blunt and rude and obnoxious with the truth, as I often was sometimes. If I was hurt and feeling jealous of the other person, for example, I see them with someone else and getting close, or they've got more friends and they're getting on well, or the job's going well and I've lost mine, or there are incidents like that, something, when I'd be angry and I'd get drunk or I'd overreact, and I'd say something blunt, rude and offensive, something that, when you're in a personal, intimate relation with someone and you've confided in each other, and that it's reckless and it's horrible to do that. I'm not saying I did that in front of others or I did it in the worst way, but I had a loose and horrible tongue, not just when I was drunk. I just was emotionally overwhelmed. It's not an excuse, really. And I didn't behave like that so much in my mid to late 20s, and certainly not in my 30s. It became rarer. In fact, I didn't have so many closer, romantic, intimate relations then. But I did have other close, intimate, emotional relations, friends, family, and even strangers on occasion that would be. Um, Especially in home care and caring for mum. I made a lot of time and effort in later years, my 30s especially, to become more patient, considerate of others, more empathetic, you'd call it, really. I lacked a degree of empathy in my personal relationships, if I'm honest, in my teen years and even into my 20s sometimes. Sometimes where I could be very loving and affectionate and considerate. I could go to a lot of time and energy to get someone the right kind of meal, to cook for them, to invite the friends round, clean the house up nice and host it well, and find a nice club, book tickets to a gig they love. Or I could make a real effort to dance for them, to talk nicely. I often did do that, but I often snapped and was rude and just reckless sometimes, and I destroyed a couple of relationships. Albeit yes, they forgave me, and I apologized sometime later, often a long time later. Sometimes, if it was a more minor thing, it would be a apology that would be quite soon, but sometimes it would take years, and sometimes a longer time. I think I didn't realize how cold and how emotionally just horrible that I could be sometimes. I wasn't like that with friends and acquaintances, funnily enough, most of the times. And I certainly wasn't like that with the general public. I wasn't like that at work. I wasn't close to colleagues or the general public, clients or, public that I would see when I worked at telesales or shops, cinemas. I worked a whole variety of different jobs. I wasn't like that majority of the time, actually. And I look back and think I was horrible and really mean sometimes in the closest relationships I had. Those people that got closest to me, and especially that was true in years later for mum as well, in our 25-year long struggle with each other, to understand each other and to emotionally support each other, not harm each other more, as we sometimes did. There were very good things in our relationships. In my romantic relationships, there were good, productive things in supporting each other. But I was aware many years later, when I look back in hindsight, there were a lot of harmful things I did really. When I took out my feelings, and I didn't probably know why I felt that sometimes. I even ended a relationship without knowing why when I was totally drunk and reckless. And I really regretted incidents like that. That would happen sometimes. Sometimes the drink as well got me into trouble as well. I think with the lust as much as the anger sometimes. Where I sometimes had a few one night stands around that age that I regretted, and I didn't know why I was doing it sometimes, or sometimes in my anger at that time I was a little wild. I don't think for those years, for the majority of the time, I got that angry. I didn't have a lot of reason to. I was quite happy. I would live with friends and housemates I got on relatively well. There were some older, more mature friends that were very supportive. Younger friends I had a lot of fun with. Had a lot of very, good times out dancing, traveling, a few holidays that we did, all sorts of holidays. And I was lucky and fortunate that I had friends from different genders, different sexualities, different ages, even really. I loved having friends around my age, and I got to love friends that were older as well. So it was good to have that different kind of support as well, actually, from different friends of different ages, really. Well, my neurotic problems really affected my relationships in many ways. Not so much friendships, perhaps. And yes, I suppose it was an issue in that, really. And it continued and still became an issue in the 20s, in my 20s, not the 1920s. Up until, my early adult years, it still remained a consistent issue, really. Not that there wasn't a lot of good and happy times, wonderful times, really a lot of fun memories. So many, I couldn't recall them all, really. It's just too many. Um, and I was in a relationship at a time with an older man, I think, and I think I became a little bit resentful at that, even though we were close friends and it was consensual and that. And I felt maybe that I was going into it for the wrong reasons sometimes, actually. And I think that sometimes I didn't know why I was having relationships at that time in my life for the next few years with older men. I don't know why. And perhaps I was lacking any kind of family structure. I didn't have a close father figure that I was seeing for those years after that. And I didn't have a wider family support network around me either. I suppose being a foster child and that, I didn't have regular family that I was then seeing over many years, and that sometimes I was looking for sort of family members, but in the wrong way, perhaps sometimes. I was lucky that sometimes I did find a lot of family members. It almost seemed like a whole package of family. Sometimes you get 3 or 4 people very close together that I'd meet and befriend, a couple of sisters and then their children, and I'd meet a couple of aunties and kind of some sisters and a brother or something. And I did a couple of family homestays, almost that I was adopted by a whole family, and by many friends of the family too. Often I found that a couple of times happened. I had like transient family really over many, many years. So I did like a couple of different homestays. I lived in a community in a very urban town at one point. I lived in and out of their houses for a couple of years. It was a group of people that knew each other very well. They were very intimate with each other. 3 or 4 different houses. There was a local pub. I met a guy that knew quite a few people. That was my way in to meeting them. And then I got close to a couple of the people that knew others in them well. It was like being adopted into a little community, really. I liken it to being like a soap opera, the stuff that went on there. I mean, there was the good, the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. And I think it's like that anywhere if you really get to know the people intimately and well enough. When you get to sort of have deep conversations, you're talking about embarrassing stuff with each other, you're really opening up more. I used to do that in people's lounges, and sometimes at the pub, but usually at the home. People that I lived with and stayed with, partied with, cried with and laughed with sometimes. We had great house parties sometimes. And I think we had a lot of good counselling sessions, sometimes that worked out well, and we supported each other. We listened to each other a lot. It's very cathartic. Sometimes we cried it through. We gave advice when we could. I heard people suffer. I heard the stories of people that suffered all kinds of abuse then, and I shared my own stories of the abuses that I'd gone through, the psychological abuse, of the abusive relationships that I'd been in the past, even my own bad within it too, as well as the bad things that happened to me. that I was then able to talk about those things, not all the time and not openly and everything, but I was able to much more talk about those things and be open. And I think it was a mutual thing. It only really worked where I found others that could open up to me too. And I found that at a few different family homestays, actually. There was also another one that years later I did as well, where it was almost like another whole community, a whole group of people. Not that I talked to everyone there openly about everything, but I was able to talk quite openly and intimately about a lot of emotional issues, really. About bullying in the past, about abusive and neglectful relationships, and about abusive relationships and things that I'd done as well when I'd been neglectful and abusive to others. That's a hard thing to talk about, as well as the abuse that you've gone through too, and how that affects you. So I was glad that I did find some people. The problem that I had was over the years, I would go and live and stay with a family, or get to befriend a group of friends, for example, for a year or two, and that happened. It happened during my student years, and then a few years later. In fact, a few years before my student life, I had the LGBTQ group, and I had a group of friends, a small friendship circle I saw regularly at home. We all tried to support each other well, even though we didn't actually live with each other, but we were in and out of each other's houses enough, going out every weekend religiously to the clubs, dancing together, that sort of thing, having a good chat and a dance every week as we did. But I think the other later homestays, the families that I lived with, I sort of lived more full time with them. So it was sort of cooking and cleaning with them, counselling with them, arguing with them sometimes, knowing about all their family issues, their illnesses, and just knowing about everything. When you live with someone, it's different, really. So and I think that I had a few of those different homestays, really. The problem that I had was that there were years that I didn't have those as well. So having like a transient kind of family, it had its great things. That sometimes I had this kind of new family that would turn up for a year or two. It happened, and there were 3 or 4 of those where it was almost a whole interactive, a whole fully made kind of family, or friendship group, however you call it, you know. And for a year or two that would happen, and there were 3 or 4 of those. And then there were many years, in fact, where I didn't really have any close connection, not to a transient family. I wasn't, seeing any of those families that I'd been with in the past. I wasn't then in closer contact with them. And that's the current situation that I'm in now. But I've been in a situation like that, similar before. And when I came back from university in the early 20s, the course had gone really bad. In fact, I'd lost the course at that point. I really had trouble in my 3rd year. I had financial troubles and emotional troubles too. And I really was quite unwell neurologically. And I don't know how I'd coped during the first 2 years with it, really. I had a few close friends at the campus at uni. There was a college tutor and the librarian, and there was also a couple of friends that I was very close to. But in the 3rd year, things really, it just transpired against me, really. It was really hard emotionally, and I didn't really feel I had that much support. I was really getting behind in my studies to begin with, and I never caught up with them. So it just got on top of me. And I was drinking heavily, depending on alcohol as a crutch, and drinking really heavily. And I was sometimes in the 2nd year, albeit I was able to maintain the studies and the work to carry on with it up to a point. But maybe it got to a tipping point when I wasn't able to. And then when the student loan was delayed, and there was a 3-week delay in me being able to get to classes finally, and I couldn't take out books. And on top of the emotional issues, I then never caught up with that. I had to abandon the student year, the 3rd year of the academic year. So I returned to Bristol, and some of the friends had moved on from the earlier support group. I then wasn't in touch with the family support group and the other friends that I'd been close to in Bristol, in Brighton rather. And then what happened was a kind of unraveling where I spiraled apart, really, and it was a real hardship for that year or so. And I had a mental breakdown, really. And I was living a few different houses, but I really wasn't able to function or live well there. I really sort of didn't see anyone that regularly. I was out of contact. The foster family had all moved away. There was Mum, my biological mother, Lorna. We'd gotten closer over the years, but she had then developed an anxiety disorder. She had a lot of psychological problems. She had a long-term psychiatric issue by that point. She'd been in and out of psychiatric hospitals for a year or two. And so she had a lot of problems, a lot of suspicion and paranoia of other people. Um, I couldn't really rely and depend upon her all the time. Sometimes when she was well, she was a great support and tried hard. There were happier times in the early years, and sometimes she herself suffered a lot from the anxiety disorder and really over worried things and was not able to support me that well through those years, really. I was homeless for a few months and was not able to cope with that, really. I had a couple of friends that I was kind of getting close to, but I didn't know that well. And I guess they didn't know my background, my emotional condition, my mental condition. They didn't know anything about the autism. They didn't know anything about my foster care background, the background of abusive relationships that I'd had. They had gotten to know me reasonably well, and I think they were trying to support me, but perhaps were not able to really. And it's no one's fault, really. I was just in a predicament at the time where I lacked any real support network and I lacked the ability to be able to find then support at the time. I was relying on drinking heavily too much as well, really. And I got really depressed thinking that I'd lost the student course, that I'd given up on that I was no longer able to do it, at least. I didn't know that if I could go back to it or not. There was a lot of doubt about that because I had to then actually give up the course or say that I'd given it up officially in order to claim any benefits at the time. I was then out of touch also with the friendship group I'd really depended on the years before that. So it was a kind of like a crux of loads of things. The foster family moved on, biological mother had a lot of accumulating emotional problems herself. And I was out of touch with all the friends that I'd acquired and was getting close to the 3 years before in Brighton. I was drinking more heavily. I was at a younger age as well, and I just didn't know how to cope with it. And then when I was homeless on top of that as well, it really just got worse, really. And I think I entered into a psychotic state at some point, to be honest. After a couple of days, I was sort of rambling the streets. I don't know how long it was. I know that it was a few nights. And I must have looked odd and weird. I was weary and I was just completely out of it, a little deranged, really. I think perhaps not drinking, I was dehydrated from it all as well. How that had all happened, really, I had stopped drinking and I'd made it a determination to. I was going to AA, I was talking about some of the abuses in the past that I experienced, and I was talking much more openly, but to strangers now, not to supportive people that I knew. And I really then tried to do the worst thing. I tried to stop drinking cold turkey without any support. And I stayed at someone's house that I didn't know that well. While the person supporting me was then away, the person that was trying to care for me a lot also had a lot of other duties in caring for others. So they were limited also in their time and in their ability to understand what needs support I had, really. I think it was some sort of more professional support I needed. And that's what I got in the end. And that's what supported me, as well as also friend support. That's what got me through in the end, really. It was more kind of professional support that I really needed anyway. But I admire and I'm thankful for those people that tried to support me through the hardest time, through the emotional degradation that I was going through my emotional breakdown, as it was really, when I became psychotic. It was a series of gradual things that happened, really. Um, as things sort of gradually sort of conspired against me, really, and I conspired against me too. I was conspiring against me because I didn't know how to support myself well. I'd never had an emotional breakdown like that. I'd never been homeless and out of contact with so many different people. At that point, it was a real shock, and I didn't know how to deal with it, really. I tried to stop drinking at someone's house I didn't know that well. I only lasted a couple of days. Somebody out of the blue from the past called that had had a really difficult, strained relationship. It triggered off some things that I really struggled, some really abusive memories of the past. I was really upset with that on top of things. And I've been kind of dependent on the drink, numbing myself to a lot of emotions. It was an outpouring, an overwhelming amount of emotions. I fled from that house. I left because I didn't know how to cope with the emotions and that. I didn't know how to. I was so breaking down around others, but I couldn't explain why or what it was. I couldn't clearly, coherently explain it as I could now. I couldn't tell you the a cluster of 8 or 9 different things that had happened. I couldn't tell you coherently that. Because I was so used to the drink, because I was so out of contact with other people for so long at that point. There were a number of different reasons. I'd not gone through any real professional kind of counselling, either one-to-one or in a group counselling, nothing really of that sort. So I had no experience of that either, really. Stupidly, um, overwhelmed emotionally and fearful of how other people would react and what I would do locked in the house. I was feeling crazed at the wall, feeling like I might smash things up, feeling completely deranged, sad, and angry, incapable of actually managing the emotions. I left the house at that point, of the friends I was staying at, not knowing where I was going, and mindlessly just walking the streets. I don't know for how long. It was certainly for a few days. I remember a few nights, a few days had passed. I was sleeping out in the parks, just resting in random places, really. I had all these cuts and bruises down me, and I think the cuts were from going through the brambles. There's a lot of vague and sketchy memories from those few days where I was going through a level of psychosis, really. I remember I jumped into Bristol Canal at some point, and I don't know why. Whether I had the intention to harm myself then, I don't know. I clambered out. I remember being in the park, shivering, freezing, and I found this old dirty orange blanket that was wrapped around me. I must have found that, or somebody gave it to me. I don't remember. I remember just being shivering when the police found me, wrapped in this bright orange blanket, and I remember that was the bizarre point of it, really. And they took me in. I'm grateful for those few times. The police and rescue services were able to find me at those times and get to me. But they didn't get to me before I actually made the suicide attempt. In any case, I don't think anyone could have known where it was escalating and where it was all leading to, really. And I'd wandered the streets quite deliriously, not knowing for how long, really. I guess it was a couple of days. I remember sunset a couple of times, so it must have been about that. I think perhaps on the third day it happened. I don't know exactly how long, really. I remember staggering around the streets, getting weirded out by different people and having a few near accidents that happened, nearly getting knocked down. I was assaulted, somebody punched me in the face, so then I had blood all down my top, and it probably looked even worse, I imagined. And I had all these cuts down my arms as well, just to make me look even more of an awful zombie. I must have appeared like that. And looking back in hindsight, yes, people must have looked at me oddly on the street and thought I must have looked a risk. I wonder why no one approached me and said, are you okay? Is there anything wrong? A few people did try to. There was even a couple that said, it took a lot of time asking me. They asked me to go in the car and said, is there anywhere we can take you? And they kindly dropped me off at mum's house. I ran away from her because I was worried. She bathed me, she looked after me, fed me, watered me. But I was worried then because she said she was going to take me to the doctors and she said they'll sort you out. And I was worried what would happen there. I was scared and I didn't know really. Actually, ironically enough, because Mum had said a lot of things about what got on in psychiatric wards, some of her paranoid thoughts, as well as some of the actual bad things she'd experienced there as well. And so perhaps that coloured and skewed my views of a psychiatric ward. But I don't know. I was wrong to run away at that time. I didn't know that it would be help that I was receiving. So I kind of I ran away when the couple tried to take me back to Mum's. Again, I was sketched up going around the streets. I didn't know where I was going. I found myself in random parts of Bristol I didn't recognise or know. It must have been suburbs of it. That weirdly, years later, I retraced my steps and I went back when I was more rational with it and found the places where I went to. I found actually a part of a railway hedge where I must have walked alongside the railway and where I must have gone through a gap in the fence and even saw the bramble bushes where I must have cut my arms on that. I remember actually going there, so I went back and retraced the steps, oddly enough. But yeah, I had some deranged time when I was mentally deranged for those few days where it was really bad, and I attempted suicide from it then. Jumped out of a tower off the second floor of Brandon Tower. It wasn't pre-planned or anything like that, really. I think I got to a point of being so deranged, and I was wandering down a street and I had the idea of ending it all. I didn't know how to ask for help or what to do, and everyone was looking at me weird, and I didn't know why or what to do about it or anything. I didn't know how to talk to anyone, and I thought it would be the only way to end things. It seemed like the rational, logical thing to do. Really, I wasn't actually emotional, and I wasn't. I had wept a few times, but I was scared, and I didn't know. I was scared of other people to approach them because I looked weird and because people reacted oddly to me, and I didn't know. It was like I become dumb and I'd somehow had this inability to talk to people really. I never experienced anything like that in my life really, is all I can say really. And I think it's a number of factors that may have caused that. I don't know. It's never happened to me since that I've had that There was another episode similar to that a few months later, but never again in my life. A few times similar when I drunk too much, but there were always then reasons for that. If I was heavily drunk, for example, you could understand someone was delirious, but not when I was sober. And I think, yes, there were probably a number of reasons caused that led towards that, and it's a shame it happened, but I don't feel bad or regret it. I think at the time it was an awful situation, and I just did an awful thing. I was desperate, and I did something that I felt was a way out of it and would end the suffering. And I didn't, and I was hurting a lot, and I didn't know what to do or how to ask for help. Really, I didn't know there was any help. I didn't know, so I just didn't know really. And so I made a few, not attempts, but I was sort of juggling with what to do about it. I even went inside a store to try and get a knife or something, but the store detective was following me around, so I couldn't do that. And then what happened was I followed this long road, and it led to this long path. It led to a long park. It's called Brandon Park, near the centre of Bristol. When I got to the park, huge park, and there was a tower at the top of it, really. And that's when the idea struck me. In fact, I was looking at a small playground at the bottom of the park, and there I was watching a young boy who jumped out of a climbing frame onto the tarmac below it, And I looked then up at the tower, Brandon Tower on top of the hill. And I guess that's what gave me the idea, weirdly. A little kid playing around in a playground that I just happened to be passing by, and I noticed. And so I then went up the tower, and that was the point. It gave me the idea, in a way, seeing him jump off the climbing frame. It was a small, little children's climbing frame, really. So, yeah, there was no kind of planned thing before that. Just literally a few minutes. It took me 5 or 10 minutes to climb up the hill, and then I went up the tower. It was a long, steeping kind of spiral staircase that goes up. I would have gone to the top of the tower, and the intention was to jump off there, I guess, because it would have seemed more likely. However, at the time, I heard echoing at the top some voices up there. So there were clearly people at the top. It was clearly occupied. How the tower is, if you go up it, it's a sort of long winding staircase, and it leads to one platform, and then there's another door leading up to another winding staircase. And if you listen up there, you can hear the voices of those people up on the higher, upper floor. And I heard those. And I sort of knew I wouldn't be able to jump with the people around me, that they might try and stop me, or it might, interfere with it somehow. I knew there was a good chance of that happening, and I didn't want anyone to stop me or be involved with it in any way. So that's the only reason I didn't go up there then to the top, really. So I suppose looking back, that's the reason I'm here, and that the body didn't get more destroyed, or I didn't die that day, or I didn't kind of, not through any fault, not through any choice of my own. And it's not because I was afraid to go to the top, or because I decided not to, or I guess it just was just one of those things, really. You can call it God's grace, you can call it just randomness, but that's the way it was. So were it not that those students were out there, and it turned out they were out there celebrating their exams, funnily enough, but there we go. And I did meet some of them, because actually some of them saw me jump off the actual tower, because I was on the floor below them. So some of them then rushed down the tower and actually then saw me at the bottom. Almost incredibly that I survived it and was okay, and that I survived with only superficial injuries, really. So, that's quite kind of an incredible thing in itself, really. I never expected that. I thought that would be the end. I was almost totally 100% convinced that that would be a surefire way to end it, and a kind of assured way for suicide. I was thinking I would go to the top of the tower, and I think it looked quite high and quite tall, quite high up. It's relatively high up. But obviously it wasn't on the first floor. So I suppose I should be thankful that I didn't go to the higher up floor. I could have had life-changing severe injuries, brain damage, or I could have just died on that day, really. In some weird ways, it was like a death in a way, or being reborn or something. It was almost like a new chapter begun at that point. I do remember climbing up on the edge of the actual tower building. I walked around. I didn't spend a long time thinking about it, and I went straight up to one of the ledges. There's 3 or 4 different areas, view out points that you can go in. It's really kind of high up, and I didn't get fazed by it. I went and stood up on the actual ledge itself. I didn't take a long time doing it. I stared out onto it. It just felt like the right thing to do somehow. I didn't feel scared, and I didn't feel in any way emotional at all. I felt somehow numb and cold emotionally at the time. It's really weird. Dead to my emotions, really, somehow. And I suppose that's how I could do it. Didn't feel so. When I looked at it in a weird way, it was a beautiful picture in a weird way. There was the sky, there was the kind of hill and all the surrounding park and the trees beyond that, and then loads of houses and buildings, and you could see the river and the boats. But I didn't stare at the view. I'd spent years visiting that actual tower before because it's a really big, scenic kind of place to visit. It's a really big tourist place. Beautiful, wonderful views of Bristol. Oddly enough, I went there years earlier, and I went there with the foster father, Richard, and foster brother, Peter. I think we went just for a day out for a trip or something, and we went up to visit it. And I remember being close to the edge on one occasion, and the foster father said, "Oh, don't get too close to the edge or something." He was wary of me because I was leaning over a bit, on my tippy toes, standing up to get a closer look over the edge, and he was worried for me. And I always remember that looking back now, oddly enough, that he'd worried me. He'd worried for me, and had warned me, don't get too close to the edge and that, but that's when I was visiting as a young child, and I think I visited years later, perhaps a few times. So I knew of the tower. I knew it was high up, and never thought about it. I never thought that it wouldn't work somehow. I never thought about the risk of it, or I had no fear of anything really. I kind of just went straight on there, stood on the ledge. A few seconds later, I jumped off. Really, it was like jumping into a picture almost, like it was a one-dimensional picture that I was jumping into somehow. Literally a second or two, I remember. Well, the fall itself, I don't remember anything, um, except a few seconds later, I was on the floor. I blacked out, and I don't remember exactly what. The first thing I remember was some people calling out, "Are you okay?" Echoing that, calling out quite a few times. And I was led collapsed on the floor under some trees. It was on a sort of lawny stretch. It was sort of grassy area. And I woke up. Well, I didn't actually fall asleep or anything, but I sort of got up, and there were a couple of the others around me. They said that they'd seen me fall. They said that they were students, but they said that sometime later. They were asking how I was and that. I remained sat on the grass on the floor for a time after that, a little bit dazed. I was just dumbfounded, confused what was going on really. I don't really remember much about that, except the students asking lots of questions. Are you okay? Why did you do it? So one of them even asked, was it to do with the exams or something that you've gone through? Um, and I didn't give any response. I didn't give any answer. I remember being sat on the actual grass, sat kind of for a while. It didn't seem that long afterwards. I cannot remember talking to them much. The paramedics then showed up, the police as well then. They obviously took me to the hospital to check me out. It was only superficial injuries, but then I was taken for the first time to the psychiatric hospital. And so, and I'm grateful there for all of the support that I received, not just from the actual nurses themselves, from doctors, but also from other patients that talked to me, from a lot of friends that then got in contact, from people that were very supportive, that visited me a lot. I had a great supportive counsellor. There were nurses that were really supportive. I had a really great experience. Yes, there was good and bad in it. Some of the medications had bad experiences, side effects that were really awful, but that was changed, and some of the other medications worked. And there were lots of considerate, kind staff. I got on with a couple really well. The patients, it was a really bizarre experience with. There were few that were very nice and caring, some that weirded me out, and I didn't know, but nothing that bad that ever happened, really. It was a very bizarre, extremely weird experience in my life, is all I can call it as, really. There were a few friends that visited often, and I'm really grateful of their support, and a support worker too, also. Then I had also a flat arranged somewhere that I could stay myself, where I could then try and support myself more, to find work again, and to try and support others again. And I'm just really grateful for all the people that were able to support me in the year or so after that. Careers advisors, people at work, managers, people at voluntary work that were really understanding and considerate, new friends that I met at community voluntary groups that were counselling and supportive, that were patient, that were kind, that were attentive, and that were not judgmental sometimes as well. And they were encouraging. And I think if it wasn't for meeting a lot of supportive friends and the counsellors, the supporters, um, of all different backgrounds, I would never have gone on to work for the next 8 or 9 years. I would never have gone on to travel, to work, to enjoy life, to go on and to support other people, and to have all those many years after that, really. Um, so I received a lot of good support and care, really. Yes, I know a lot of things weren't ideal. There were medications prescribed that were wrong. There were even staff members that said things that didn't make any sense, that were sometimes wrong also. There were outbursts of patients that were violent. They didn't directly impact me, but there were people that were delirious themselves and argumentative and violent, and there were people that were rude and abusive. But I think even in those times in the psychiatric ward, it was relatively well looked after and secured, and people looked out for each other on the whole. I tried to look out for others, and I think others looked out for me there. And I kind of just feel grateful. I got through those kind of real hard times living in that, really. I had a lot of good housemates in the years after that as well. The next few years, I had lots of good housemates and lots of good voluntary placements as well, actually. So I was really glad after the mental breakdown that year, receiving lots of support. And it isn't just the critical support that you receive during the psychosis and during those months, when you're in hospital and when it's especially bad. It's all of the support that you receive from friends, from acquaintances, from people, colleagues at work, even from strangers that you'll meet as well at support groups. It's people that you'll meet just going out and about. Um, it's everything, really. It's all the little support, really. It's the community support groups. It's people having flexible hours, or people making the effort to try and understand and fit the work actually around whatever emotional conditions that you have. Um, it's people making the effort to try and include you and encouraging you. And I think it's a two-way thing, of course. You've got to make the effort as well. You've got to work hard. You've got to try and find jobs that are suitable to the mental, emotional, social position that you're in. It's a hard struggle to do that, to come back from a complete mental breakdown, and being hospitalized for some months. It's a difficult struggle, and that it took me a few years to really get back to functioning, even part-time, to be honest with you. I would say there was about a year or so, maybe a couple of years, when I really wasn't supporting anyone. I wasn't caring about anyone. It's probably good that I wasn't, because I wasn't capable of it, really. I was just so out of it. I was struggling only to support myself, really, to cook, to clean, to wash, to try and counsel myself, really, to stop myself doing anything that bad, really, I guess. And I am only grateful I didn't cause any major problems or cause anything, harm anyone too much at that time, really. There were a number of times when I caused some near accidents, and I'm grateful that I didn't there, but for the grace of God, things that could have happened, awful. But I, you know, restrained myself a lot of the time. But I wouldn't say for a few years that I was that supportive. I couldn't support other people that much, really. I gradually did become much more. And I was much more supportive, both in my work and also in my personal relationships as well, really. And so I became a much more full-time carer for Mum over the years. I think I needed to, as her condition is progressing. She had progressive lymphedema, so it's a progressive disease. Well, it's a progressive disability as well. It meant that she increasingly over the years found it much harder to go out to be physically active and exercise. She couldn't go out and shop or cook or clean or to even wash in the way that she used to. So for a few years, she became much more dependent on me for both practical, physical, and also for emotional support, because she also had a brain cyst and this anxiety disorder. She'd had some abusive relationships too, so I could relate to that. And so, yeah, we could support each other much more through that as well. And I think after the breakdown, and after a year or so of working on myself, I think I was able to part-time support her much more and support a few friends. And then eventually, I went back into actually caring. I hadn't done that for a long, long time, for many years, not in a professional sense. But I kind of went into caring as a professional thing finally. I'd only really cared professionally for Mum and a few friends, really, to be visiting regularly every day, to make sure people had their medication, calling up doctors, cooking, cleaning, washing, counselling, all those kind of things, and many more. I didn't really go into that professionally until I was much older. I would say many years. I think it's probably sensible I didn't in the earlier years. I don't think I would have been able to, quite frankly. And I think I was just, it wasn't something I felt driven to do in earlier life. I worked as a telesales customer assistant, an usher, a shop assistant. I worked as a farm assistant for a couple of years on an ecological farm. I really felt a strong desire to do that, to do an actual placement while I was living and working with people, and that was great to do that for a year. And I felt called to do a variety of different things really in my life. And I think it was just at that right time and place. In my mid-30s, I'd gone through a lot of care myself. And so I had that experience as well of receiving a lot of mental health support, emotional support, occupational support as well, from a more holistic perspective. People that are supporting you nutritionally, shopping for you, but also sort of discussing medications, that are more familiar with, you know, lots of different side effects that are more familiar with actually how to talk about emotionally sensitive subjects as well as actually the practical subjects, what the anatomical parts are, how to talk more coherently about actual illnesses. I don't think I did that very well, really. I was an average sort of home carer, if I look back, if I'm honest. I've done about 12 different jobs over the years. I think that's perhaps one that I felt just at that time and place, it was the right time to go in for it. I think for 18 months that I worked caring for people, visiting others in their own home, just providing community support, I think it was a great and worthwhile thing to do, really. And I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to meet so many people. It was honouring, really, to be invited into other people's home because it is such a personal thing, actually, as well. To be involved in someone's home, to eat dinner with someone, to talk about the most intimate things. I talked with people about their own deaths. I talked about their terminal illnesses. I talked about their relationship struggles. I saw people in the last few months of their life, sometimes the last few weeks in a few people's cases, and often in the last few years. I saw them at their darkest hour. I saw them breaking down in tears. I saw them talking about how in grief they were at losing their relationships, their jobs, their abilities. I saw people in anger and in sadness and in joy and in gratitude as well, and just having precious moments with their friends and family. And I felt it was special that I got to share, and that I was able to support a few people in some ways. I think I was a buffoon and put my foot in it and said awful things sometimes, especially in the earlier times. And I was kind of insensitive in some things I said. And often, more often, even in later years, in the later visits, I was more often just not able to know what to say, and I just could shrug. And I often would listen, but I didn't know how to advise or what to say. I did try and give advice often when I could, and I was quite patient, and I was really attentive, and I tried hard to support people. I think it was almost giving back what people had given to me. I felt that, moral obligation to do that, to try and give back to others as much as people given to me, really. I think it's important to sort of give and take in life, really. When you're able to give whatever physical, emotional, mental, financial, spiritual, whatever the support is, it's trying to give the support to others that you are capable of doing, and that you can, anything that you can do if you're in the position that you can. If you can't, you can't. If you're not, when you're mentally not well, it doesn't make sense to do it then, does it? And if you're not emotionally or financially able to, you can't do it. Of course you can't. So, but it's giving that support when you can. It's having the courage to do it. It's more than that, having the patience to do it as well. It's having the desire to do it, because there's a lot of fear in doing it as well, really. It can cost you money, it can cost you time. Caring for a sick relative is hard. Caring for someone who's sick, who's mentally ill, is hard. I found that immensely hard. When I was caring for someone that had long-term mental problems with an anxiety disorder, I knew that they were going to accuse me of a lot of things I didn't do. And I knew that that would be the risk going into it. I knew visiting some patients that they would be violent and shout abusive and homophobic and slanderous things to me. I knew some people would be rude and sneering and mean-spirited to me, but I still had to carry on caring for them anyway, knowing that they couldn't help that sometimes, or trying to find out if they could or not, and not knowing sometimes. And it's trying to care for people, however much you're provoked and angered and triggered. That's the challenge going into care, really. Going in when you're drunk and hungover, fed up and sad. Going up when you've got your own emotional problems. Going up when you're obsessed and angry about you get on off girlfriend, or about mum, or the accusation she made, or when you're just obsessed about your own problems and having to put your problems aside and thinking about someone else's problems and not your own. It's a worthwhile thing to do, but it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing when you are used to being obsessive about your own problems. And as I was, so I found it a great challenge to do that. But nevertheless, it also was also weirdly a great thing therapeutically for me. In many ways, that part of the occupational kind of therapy was always an important part of my life. Work was always fundamentally important to me. I started working when I was 13 or so, paper rounds and that sort of thing. I was in full-time job working 16 or 17, and I loved doing that. It gave me that structure, something to do that I thought was of some use, however small or big. And I was learning from it, and it was something socially cathartic. It's giving something to society as well as receiving something too. So it's a mutually beneficial thing. But I had never done it in a caring capacity. And so I think it was much more of a therapeutic thing in that sense. I'd had caring relationships before, struggling to care for sick relatives and sick friends, but I'd not done it to a point where I was caring for strangers and anyone that I was asked to, where before then I could choose. I want to care for my friends that I get on well with. I want to care for them because I can get on well with them, or I've got a lot in common with them. We laugh together, we like the same sort of music, or we're both gay, or we're attracted to the same sort of guys, and we both got the same moral outlook on life or something, or we've both got similar views. You can do that when you're friends. The friends that I cared for, I was closer to for a reason. I think it was perhaps different with mum. We had a lot of different temperamental differences, but I would say we were very similar as well. I'm just so grateful, that I had the opportunity to have so many mutually beneficial relations. But it isn't a black and white picture, really. There are also mutually degrading relationships, mutually enabling relationships that enable kind of addictive, abusive things or obsessional things sometimes too. And so, I had a lot of great grey area relationships. And I think if I look back on them, they were lighter grey, really, rather than darker. I think overall, on balance, that most of those relationships were more mutually beneficial than mutually destructive. But nothing was ever mutually beneficial all the time. There was never any perfect relationship. No, only nostalgia and romanticizing things leads me into that delusion, really. Yes, there was always arguments and people taking out their own frustrations, offloading on each other unnecessarily. But I don't think that ever happened regularly, or not to such an extent in my own personal relations. So I could always stop that and say no or something. However bad someone else's mental condition was, I could always protect myself and say, no, if it's not right for me, then it's not. But when I went into home care, I guess when you're doing it more professionally, that's different. So my 18 months of being a home care assistant is quite a different experience than the decades of caring for friends, especially for mum, and being cared for as well by others, in often mutually beneficial relations, as well as sometimes mutually destructive ones also. It's totally different when you're professionally caring for others, just because you don't get to choose what race or religion, what temperament or gender or sexuality that person is. You don't get to choose all those things. You've got to care for someone, even if they say things that you fundamentally disagree with, even if you don't really understand a lot of things about them. Even if you're offended by a lot of the things they might say sometimes, it's trying and it's going that extra mile, therefore. It's caring for someone. It's an extra test in a way. It makes me in awe of those people that are able to do that for a longer period of time, because I found that a real emotional challenge. I felt triggered so often, and I did react to it sometimes, if I'm honest. So usually in a passive aggressive way. Usually I wasn't blunt and abusive. You couldn't be anyway. But usually someone would say something a bit sarcastic, and I'd say something sarcastic too. But you never really know if it was a joke or not, or Sometimes I often bit my lip as well, and I would say, and I would, and I think you've got to be very patient and forgiving, really, with each other in that. And it's also the colleagues and the different people you work with as well. And I found that a challenge too. Some colleagues would be really left wing and really attentive and a bit over the top, a bit mollycoddling, I suppose, really, just trying to sort of do too much for someone and making decisions on people's behalf. And you get other kind of right wing carers that are a bit opposite, really, not even making a decision for someone is not really capable of making sensible, rational choices anymore. I'll give you an example of that I had one colleague I was working with. We were visiting someone with a really high level of autism at the time. He was on his own most of the time, just asocial rather than antisocial. If you'd ever ask him what he wanted done, he'd say nothing. And all the care plan guides said it was just to do a little light cleaning, a little light chat, and just give him the basic meds, food, and that sort of thing, really. And all the other people that had visited had never really attempted to sort of engage him in a deeper conversation, any more meaningful, more than just a sort of a little chat and exchange a greeting, here's your medication, and that, blah, blah, blah. Um, and I just kind of made much more an effort to kind of visit him for longer and to try and sort of open him up, really, and find things of interest that he could talk about, really. And I found that after a few months, he was able to open up a lot more, and we were able to have a lot of interesting conversations. And when I first visited, I was quite alarmed that he would do this sort of rocking motion all the time. It would be really off-putting, actually. And a few times I even snapped and said, "Just stop it, please," because I got frustrated all the time. No matter what I do, I'd be sat there trying to talk to him, ask questions, wouldn't respond to anything, and he just kept rocking for weeks on end. It went. Until eventually I was able to sort of ask questions that he was more interested. I don't quite know how it happened now, but he did eventually stop doing that for limited times. Sometimes when he talked more, or when he was listening to me. Sometimes when I was responding to things he said, rather than just doing my own kind of spiel and having my own pre-programmed speeches things I thought he might be interested in. I was amazed that he did stop rocking, and like some of the carers there, they hadn't really kind of thought to do that. It was a district nurse actually that told me, you need to actually take the upper hand, even though he looks like an adult. You need to say, I'm the adult in this. I'm going to engage conversations. I'm going to prompt conversations. I'm going to push him to talk much more. I'm going to push him to open up. I'm going to push him because it's in his interest, because it's good for him. And I'm going to encourage him to open up. And when the district nurse, an older woman, she told me all this, if he says, don't clean the flat, don't bother cleaning the bed, then you need to go there and say proactively, I'm going to clean the bed, I'm going to clean the sheets, I'm going to do the essential cleaning. You need to announce it. And then if he says okay and consents, then you go along with it. You need to take the firm upper hand and be a parent and be firmer in that. Now, I'd not understood what it was to care for someone with high level needs autism and other people with similar conditions and other mental conditions, dementia. I cared for people that were very elderly, sometimes people with a variety of different combinations. And so it was a whole learning curve for me as well, really. Um, I'm not saying that those carers that erred on the side of caution were wrong on that. Perhaps they were right to respect someone's choice not to talk and not to have a clean house or clean bed to sleep in and clean clothes. Or perhaps, you know, it's right when someone's not capable of making those choices to sort of encourage and push them really to be hygienic and clean and to take the upper hand and do it for them. And then see if they go along with it. And then, it's learning how to deal with a variety of people with a whole variety, a spectrum of different mental, physical, emotional, and social different conditions. And everyone's unique. That's what I learned about that, really. It was a really fascinating, difficult struggle. I don't think my home care that I was especially good or well qualified. I'm not a particularly empathetic person. Quite the opposite in some relationships. I was a little, well, I'm not psychopathic all the time, but I was a little cold and detached in many things. I think I was very kind and caring to others when I was out in public and to friends and to people in general. I was often very happy and very kind and well meant and sometimes funny, sometimes just a bit silly and stupid. But usually I was quite happy when I was out. I guess from the ages of 15 up to around the breakdown at 24, so I was kind of reasonably quite happy and about. But I guess it's kind of hard to sort of be like that when you have your own mental condition that I then had developed for those years. I think I always had the mental condition, but I think it kind of then got worse when I didn't have the social support. The emotional kind of condition that I was in got worse. I have got so many reasons to be grateful for so many different people, really, in actual fact. In a way, like I so much so that in a way, I've come to that conclusion that what makes us a huge amount of who we've been in our lives is the people that we were around, the people that supported us, that counselled us, that cared for us, that policed us, that loved us, that doctored us. I can just give you countless examples of people that saved my life, extended my life, that benefited my life so much. I wouldn't have gone on to be a cook or cleaner or counsellor or home care assistant to anyone without those people that had supported me. Without the family that had seen that I had a bad case of pneumonia, rushed me to a hospital in time, without that doctor that got me the antiviral treatment so that I was able to have the pneumonia cleared up. I would never have, without all those support workers, over the professionals over those months, and the friends over many years, and all the managers at work, without colleagues, without housemates, without friends that supported me in a whole multitude of ways. Without the WPC police officer that went outside and found a rough sleeper sleeping in the freezing cold weather in the middle of a supermarket car park and got me into a hostel for a couple of nights until the weather got better. It's people like that that have saved my life. The rough sleepers that looked after me when I slept for 2 months outside homeless, that made sure, and I met a couple of rough sleepers out there that I tell you what, I don't know if "save my life" is the right word, but that were there through the hard time in my life. For a few nights, a complete stranger that was there at the hardest point in my life, or one of them. Somebody that took me in when I was completely homeless, that had absolutely nothing to offer them whatsoever that they knew of, albeit I did work for them actually, so maybe I did have some things to offer. But I turned up smelly, dirty, trampish, bedraggled, looking a complete state, that cared enough and saw enough in me to invite me into their home, to be a friend, to work and live with them, and that I was happy to repay them, to care for them as well, and to work for them in their job. And people that took me in and that cared for me. I was so fortunate that I had so many people really in my life. It's led me to that conclusion. I wonder if that's not true for everyone, really, though. We are who we are, really, and we did what we did, not just because of our own effort, our willpower, our determination. For better or worse, whatever good or bad things we do, we also do it and we're able to do it because of all the care that we've received. You know, I couldn't have carried on living. I couldn't have done any half of the things that I did in my life. I could never have been a carer for mum over those many years. I could never have worked 18 months in home care. I could never have worked 15 years for the public in a variety of different customer service roles. I could never have had the great relationships with housemates, friends, or family over the years if it wasn't for all those other people that cared for me, counselled for me, cooked for me, cleaned for me, shopped for me when I wasn't capable, for those few months and for the few years as well sometimes. I got a lot to be thankful for, really. And I think we do. I think we all do, really, in many ways. And I thank God for all of the people that I've met that have been able to love and care and support and counsel and cook and wash and clean and all manner of things for me. And I'm glad that I was able to care for others in small ways. And I think I was a mad carer sometimes, if I'm honest. I was sometimes perhaps a bad carer, and I took my frustrations out on others. And I sometimes didn't think for others enough when I was obsessive about myself sometimes, and wallowed in my own depression and got too drunk and obsessive sometimes. But I did care a lot for many years, and I was a loving carer as well as sometimes a mad carer as well, really. I was a real mad carer sometimes as well. I can't say otherwise. And I don't feel guilty about it when I was really mad. When I did things and I couldn't help, if it was real madness, then that's. I can only feel guilty about the things I did when I was a bad carer, you know. Well, the worst things, I suppose, turning up drunk sometimes and that, is not so good really, is it? Being argumentative, being rude to people, reacting, being argumentative to people that were already ill sometimes. Taking things overly personal, being overly sentimental, saying wishful, nice things to people all the time when it was actually just not true in any way. Like saying to terminally ill people, oh, you're bound to find a treatment eventually and all that. Saying things that were ill-educated and actually just reckless and thoughtless sometimes, and doing that too much. I'm not saying I didn't care a lot about people and I wasn't attentive, and I was a loving carer a lot as well. I took the time to shop well for people. I researched a lot of hours on people's treatments and medicines. I had a lot of discussions and writing reports on that. I cooked and cleaned and tried to wash people and tried to be quite sensitive in doing those things. I did make a lot of effort with people. I was very attentive and caring and that. But I could also be blunt and rude sometimes. And, I regret being insensitive with people when they were very ill sometimes. And I regret sometimes not thinking empathetically what it must be like for someone living in that position. And now here I am, ironically enough, and I'm living on the other side of it now. Having been a caring friend and a carer for mum, and then a home care assistant, and now I'm the one who's living with I'm living with a physical disease as well as the mental disorder as well. So I'm the one who's, I guess we all need caring for in some ways, but now I'm the one who's living with this sort of physical disease and this disability that it's giving me now. So I've got to look after myself more now, and I feel sad that I'm not able to care for others in that way. I can't have that intimate, close, caring relationship that I have with lots of friends and with mum. I can't have the home care professional work. I have a mixed feeling about it, if I'm honest. Yes, there were drudgery and hardships in it. The early mornings, the arguments, the dirty work, the endurance of it too, the frustration of it sometimes. There are a lot of things I don't miss at all about it, if I'm honest, about the work and the personal relations. But many more of the things that I deeply miss and that I loved greatly. The friends that we nurtured each other, where we cooked for each other, cleaned for each other, where we got to share stories about each other and to love each other, danced with each other sometimes. Some of the people that I met in home care actually were like family to me. Some people told me about the most intimate things in their life, and I told other people about my own abuses, my own victimhood, my own loves, my own romantic loves, as well as my own family loves, and so I would consider those people family. To me, they'll always be family. It doesn't matter how many years it is since they passed on. It doesn't matter what they were called, or that's not important to me. We're still always going to be family, and we'll always, whether it's another place or time, what we had was special then. And I'm thankful for all the special relationships that I've had, really, and that I've been able to have such supportive relationships, really. Yes, there have been, it's a double-edged sword, life, isn't it, really? And all human relationships are, ultimately, because we can all do good and bad. I choose to look back and focus and be thankful for all the good relationships. Not that any relationship is ever all good, but I choose to see the good within each of the relationships, all of the mutually beneficial parts, where we cared for each other. And I think you've got to also look at the mutually destructive parts of the relationship, where I harmed other people. You've got to look at where I allowed other people to harm me too. So those are the important things to look back at as well. The regrets of life, really. And so that's what the next video is too, because this was too much to talk about all of it, really, in it. I wanted to talk about some of those people that have cared a lot for me over the years, whether it's foster parents, friends of the foster family, social workers, teachers at school, scout leaders, best friends, schools, father figures, friends that I met at nightclubs, dancing partners, managers at work, many adopted aunties, hi, and many other adopted family members as well, really. It's just too many names, really, and friends that I met through home care as well, travelling friends, My gosh, I have been really fortunate in many ways. Um, that's not to say that there haven't also been areas where I've been missing lots of family relations through long periods of time as well, areas of emptiness in some ways, and that there haven't also been some, mutually destructive relationships, and abusive relationships too. Those are the things I got to come on still to talk about. I thought it's just too much to talk about all relationships in any one kind of chapter, really. So I really wanted to just focus on mutually caring relations in this chapter, really. And what a wide variety of different kinds of caring relationships that there are. From family care, friendship care, even from strangers caring for you. The doctor that gave me the antibiotic treatment, the WPC, the rough sleepers out that I slept with. I would say there were 15 or so that over a few weeks. The complete strangers that I went to live with in doing work placements sometimes. Um, there are just so many different people you that can give you so many different types of care. You know, strangers that can care for you and that you end up caring for. I guess everyone in home care. Well, no, not all of them were strangers. Some were one-off visits. A lot became acquaintances. A few became friends, and just a few became close family. And that's, I guess, the sort of pyramid of relationships. Really, you can get to know a few people extremely well, and a lot of people quite well, and some people not so well, perhaps. But I think it's like that. You can get on with some of the people some of the time, but you can't get on with all the people all the time. And perhaps it is like that because we've got all different kinds of physical, mental, emotional, social, financial, and spiritual abilities. There's a whole spectrum, a whole wide range of so many different kinds of abilities, really. So I just wanted to touch on briefly some of the different kinds of care that I've received, really, in my life. I'm glad that I've been able to care for many, but much more was the care that I've received in my life, really. And I'm grateful. I guess a lot of the time, a lot of that care you can take for granted sometimes. Even the one-off incident when somebody saves you out the blue and does something dramatic, or even when somebody's enduring from and visits you through an illness for years on end and is willing to hear about diseases and side effects and for every day for years and years. And when someone's able to go through all that, you know, sometimes you take it for granted because somebody is there with you, because you forget to give thanks for something because it's just been there all the time and because you're so used to it sometimes. Or sometimes as well, it can be because it's something that you just haven't thought about for such a long time, from so many years ago, and you forget that what made you who you are today and how you got to where you are now is partly dependent on how you got through the past. And so there's a whole conveyor belt of all these different people, all these different groups, of all the different people that have supported and cared for us. Isn't that true for us all? Yeah, we can look back at the negative in life, and I think it's important to be honest. But we should never just look back and say, here's a history of all the abusive relationships, or here's a history of all the neglectful relationships as well. Those things are important to look back at, but I think that we need to look back and be grateful for all the different past caring relationships, loving relationships, family relationships, nurturing relationships, whatever kind of caring relationships they are. Yeah, it's important to look back, not just to be thankful and pay lips talk to it, but actually it takes a long time to look back and discern and know what was caring about that. How was I caring? How was the relationship caring? How was that benefiting family, society? How is it benefiting me? Is it benefiting others? It's asking those fundamental questions honestly and sincerely, and being able to then know and describe, concisely what the relationship was, because things can be so complex and disputed and difficult to actually talk about. I want to talk about a few of those relationships, more in depth, actually, about some of the more caring relationships and the good and bad within it, because I think some of them actually have a lot of really good specific dilemmas that are really kind of conflictual. It's difficult to know. It's grey areas. There's a lot of debate within it. And I think a lot of other people could relate to those areas too. Times when there's a lot of good care, but also there's a lot of potential areas of doubt, and you're not sure if that's really caring. and how it can be improved. And only through discussing it and trying to share with others can we really learn that, really. If I hadn't spent 18 months working with other home carers and getting to know them and working and getting to know a variety of people from different positions with different physical, mental, emotional, social, and all the different positions, then I wouldn't have known so much about how to sort of get on with people more. I think you learn through experience rather than reading other people's experience alone, really. So I want to talk, in my next thing about some of the more specific examples of the different complex struggles of that caring relationships can be, and some of my regrets as well. Haven't made that video yet about the regretful relationships, and a regretful relationship can be something that you regret with society, with a religion, with politics, with a group of people, with yourself, with God, so it can just be with anything, really. It can be a relationship with other people, or it could be a relationship with groups of people. I've got lots of regrets in my relationship with others, but there were just so many things also to be grateful for and to give thanks for as well, really.